This week on the Below the Surface podcast, we're discussing Netgear, Gigabyte, and NVIDIA Rowhammer attacks. Stay tuned. Below the Surface, coming up next. Welcome to Below the Surface. It's episode number 55, being recorded on Wednesday, July 16th, 2025. I again have roped in my co-workers doing podcasts with me. Mr. Chase Snyder is here with us. Chase, welcome.
What's up?
Wes Daubry is here.
Hi there.
And Vlad Babkin.
Hello.
We got like a nice rounding out of everyone from Eclipsium, right? Wes is sales engineering, Vlad is research, Chase is marketing. I have a foot in both marketing and research and engineering, so it's good representation. Before we dig into the topics today, just a quick announcement. Below the Surface listeners can learn more about Eclipsium by visiting eclipsium.com/go. There you'll find the ultimate guide to supply chain security, an on-demand webinar I presented called Unraveling Digital Supply Chain Threats and Risk, a paper on the relationship between ransomware and the supply chain, and a customer case study with DigitalOcean. If you're interested in seeing our product in action, you can sign up for a demo at eclipsium.com/go. So, speaking of the product, not that we're going to make a product pitch, but we're going to we're going to talk in general about Netgear. And we're not going to pick on Netgear. It's actually a good thing for Netgear, in my opinion. We'll talk about how it's actually used in the enterprise, whereas most will associate it with home use or SOHO, small office, home office, small enterprise kind of stuff. But they kind of seep their way into the enterprise. We've got some great product support for Netgear that was based on requests, basically. So I don't know, Wes, do you want to start with Netgear, as you're probably the closest to our customers that have some of these challenges with this type of gear leaking its way, right?
Yeah. So I'll start with a little bit about what we've seen with Netgear, but also a little bit about what some recent news and some recent things regarding Netgear as well. So our customers, where we've actually seen Netgear in place is in one of two use cases. One, where they're looking for inexpensive products or relatively inexpensive products targeted in even in some cases disposable use cases, where they can go and put rather inexpensive things that are meant to be sent out to be cost effective to do a task, and then afterwards, if that device is no longer needed, maybe it's even disposed of.
Right. They call those flyaway kits. I don't know where that term came from, but that's
exactly. And those things are designed to just be a simple bundle of things that allow them to complete a task, whatever that task may be. Now, the other area where we see Netgear stuff is a lot of times in things like mergers and acquisitions. You come in, buy another company, and you find that you have people that have done unmanaged switches or other Netgear equipment, but also in the standpoint of where, like you said, SOHO or places where they needed non-managed stuff. Now, we may have seen in the news recently that there was a number of vulnerabilities discovered for Netgear equipment. And, it was, I think there were over 500 recent ones, including things like remote code executions and things that are known as being exploited in the wild. And this overlaps real heavily with some of the things that we've talked about in the past, with things like Salt Typhoon, Volt Typhoon, Flax Typhoon, Silk Typhoon, all the different typhoons and all the other APTs out there that look at these devices and say, okay, there's CEVs or KEVs, excuse me, known exploited vulnerabilities.
I think there was 8 of them I put in the blog post that were on the
8 of them?
As a KV, yeah.
Nice. So I mean, with 8 KEVs, you end up in scenarios where if you're working with a device that's end of life, like we see a lot in these cases where people have bought these things, they just lived in an environment because they're unmanaged in most cases, or it lightly managed. And we end up in scenarios where now these devices still exist out there with vulnerabilities that organizations don't know about.
I have a theory as to why they exist for a long time, and this is actually a testament to Netgear, is they're actually really well made for the price point. You
Mm-hmm.
get a lot of value, especially if you just, like you said, Wes, you need an unmanaged switch. In fact, I think I have one hanging in the corner of my office right now that aggregates the devices in my office. And I mean, crap, knock on wood, right now I'm going to jinx myself, but they're solid and they just run. They're performant. If I don't really need to manage it, the
Mm-hmm.
other option, I mean, I've had TP-Link is, similar manufacturer. Their switches have worked just fine for me as well. Now, I've also bought um, used Cisco gear, like 3500 series switches. I've also got some of the Cisco small business, and while those are managed, they tend to have a lot of vulnerabilities that end up not being fixed because they're end of life. So
Mm-hmm.
in some cases, you're almost better off getting the Netgear unmanaged device because it doesn't really pose a threat. If it's unmanaged, it doesn't present itself on the network. Now they do have managed switches and obviously a lot of wireless access points that are very popular. I don't use them on the access point side, although Netgear's routers on the access point side, the Nighthawk was, very highly regarded in terms of a Wi-Fi router. So they end up pretty popular and they end up working their way into an enterprise in the remote office, in flyaway kits, like Wes said, acquisitions, and you just end up with this gear because it works, right? Because it's pretty good gear.
Yeah, and the key thing there is that when these things have lived in these environments for so long, you end up in scenarios where no one's actually paying any attention to them, like you said,
Yeah.
and then they end up being targets of opportunity. And that's one of the things that we've seen in some of these APT campaigns where they specifically have targeted Netgear.
Yeah.
And so they're using these known exploited vulnerabilities and getting into Netgear, and no one even knows that they're there. So I mean, imagine infinite dwell time in an environment as long as you don't go and do something else to be caught. And that gives you all the time in the world to research, collect information, and at some point, move laterally. And we're absolutely seeing that in our customers and hearing about it in the industry as a whole.
This is why asset inventory is like the core foundational necessity for cybersecurity, because if you have stuff in there that you don't know about, it's fundamentally it's gonna become vulnerable at some point.
And I think this type of equipment is, at least in my experience, very common to make its way through non-official channels sometimes into your network. And unless you're looking for it, you don't know it exists. Someone ran out of, I think this like literally has happened, right? If not, I'm just making it up, but I'm pretty sure that it's happened, right? You're doing a network upgrade or some kind of networking project, and you didn't order enough Cisco switches, or you've got this remote site that you're like, I don't have any more of my enterprise gear, my Juniper, my Cisco, whatever it is. So someone go to Best Buy, because there's always a Best Buy near where you are. At least that's the one electronics store that you can go buy a switch, slap it in the network, and call it a day. And then it just runs and works forever. And now you've got this thing on your network. I literally think that's how it happens.
Yeah,
Same thing with
yeah,
the
I think
access points. Oh, I need coverage over here. Like, oh, someone just slaps a Netgear wireless access point there, and then you never update the firmware. It's not managed. And then, Wes, like you said, attackers are like, there's any of that hanging out. People aren't paying attention to it. It's probably vulnerable because it has old firmware, and so it's a target.
Yep, hit the nail on the head. Shadow IT is absolutely an avenue that these types of devices make it into IT infrastructures. But you also see this in scenarios where, especially after COVID, for work from home folks, the people that we have doing work from home to have this kind of equipment inside of their own networks at home that can then piggyback and use that as an avenue to come in through something like a SD-WAN device or something along those lines that rides on the same network.
Yeah, exactly. Also, I want to say to Netgear's credit, because I've been looking into IoT devices since like 2006, right, and following them fairly closely since then. Many of the Kev listed vulnerabilities, so known exploited vulnerabilities, most are from 2022. One is from 2021 and one is 2023. Many of them are for gear that has reached end of life, and so they're not going to produce an update for it. And what we see today with Netgear is the devices they are manufacturing, bringing to market, and supporting today are covered under their bug bounty program. I spoke about this on previous podcasts. Netgear has a great bug bounty program. Casey Ellis is my friend, right? But they use BugCrowd. I like BugCrowd. I mean, again, full disclosure, Casey's a good friend of mine, so I support his company. Regardless, I'd still support his company because I think they're great. But Netgear's had a great bug bounty program. In fact, some of my other friends have been researchers participating in their bug bounty program. Matt Brown has a few Netgear bug bounty reports to his name of things that he's found. There were vulnerabilities. They fixed it, and he got a payout. So I don't know if it was 2022 was like the turning point for Netgear, where they came under scrutiny from, who knows, FTC. It could be a number of different pressures that they received to go, oh, we need to pay attention to security, create a bug bounty program, and have greatly increased the resiliency in their firmware, in my opinion. I've looked personally at some recent Netgear stuff, and there isn't the obvious things that you were finding 2022 and prior. So props to them. What else, Vlad? Have you ever looked at Netgear firmware?
So I don't think I looked at Netgear specifically, but from what I understood your description, so Netgear is mostly gonna be like your usual home/small business offering, which somehow also makes its way into enterprise. So most of them are kind of similar in how it's structured. I would assume it's just your normal Linux. Like, actually, let me pull up what our team did to actually support it.
Yeah. I believe we support the firmware integrity validation. We have a large
Yeah.
number of Netgear firmware samples because they're on the internet for people to download and up their devices. So that allows us to create a database and do firmware integrity and say, is the firmware you're running really the firmware from Netgear, or has it been tampered with? Which I think is awesome, especially in the case of a flyaway kit where it could be plugged into who knows what network in contact with who knows what kind of attackers. When it comes back, is that firmware been tampered with or not? Is usually that's a pretty common use case actually for our customers, Wes, right?
It is absolutely, and one of the interesting parts there that you mentioned is that since these are basically just an embedded version of Linux on them, all the same standard, I'll say forensics and DFIR techniques can be leveraged on these devices too. Every time I've touched a Netgear device, it pretty much had a complete shell on it. So I could do all kinds of fun stuff on it. And that includes doing, what I would call best practices on these devices for monitoring for change and looking at config changes and monitoring for malicious processes and all of those things as well, just from a standard security perspective on these devices.
Yep. It also allows to download self-image. Like, I can see that our team actually found stuff that does it. So in this case, you can download the entire image and check it for integrity, I assume. Also,
you can
that
get
does
an
have
image
logging.
of an image of the running firmware.
I presume yes. Like,
That's awesome.
yeah, I'm just looking at what the team implemented, so I didn't dig too hard. And also you can get logs, which is also super useful. Like, I mean, log of requests is sometimes much more useful than what you'll get from the file system, because it might be easier to hunt down if it even was attempted to attack this device or not.
Yeah. Yeah, we do. It's
So,
interesting. The kinds of things that we do are the kinds of things that I would recommend that people do for devices that's super hard, right? It's looking at your logs from these devices to determine if there's evidence of some type of malicious activity. And we've actually built into the product a way to do that for certain devices.
mhm.
The other thing is not just looking at the firmware, but the binaries as well. So are there vulnerabilities in my device is one question. Is there an active threat on my device? So like an EDR, but for these type of devices. And the ability to be able to pull stuff off of that device and bring it back into what we call automata and analyze that is, I mean, the team just gave me an update, and it's all the things that you would want, your security software looking for. Like, is there a known vulnerability? Is there a known threat? But also, the team is really great at creating the generic things that we would do, Wes, as you mentioned, like digital forensics, that you would do, like, is okay, there may be this threat, but are there variants of that threat? What else I could look for that's similar? Our software actually automates that process, can tell you, like, hey, you've got Tiny Shell on Netgear, right? And we've never seen that in the wild, but we've seen it on a Juniper device. But because our detections are generic enough, it actually will detect that on different platforms. So actually, Chase, I just sent you notes on those capabilities that we have that have been rolling out recently. And I think it's super impressive, especially in this context.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
the problem with devices that all of them are slightly different from one another. And by slightly, I mean a lot. So they don't provide the same capabilities. Like, some devices don't even provide you a normal shell, so there you're kind of limited. So you have to support like huge variety of stuff.
And I feel like the industry, and I haven't like really dug in and checked, but what I'm hearing is, and somewhat observing, is that the processors for these IoT devices years ago were based on MIPS architecture, right? And so when I was looking at the WRT54G, that was a classic, very popular router, right? That ran a MIPS sock that from Broadcom. Broadcom, I believe, made the actual sock, and it was a MIPS based architecture, and it's a very reduced instruction set. It's interesting. I was listening to a podcast, and one of the hosts said in college they learned MIPS assembly and architecture because it was such a reduced instruction set. It was much easier to learn. You get into x86, x64, the instruction set is huge, right? So it was a good proving ground. And then they said that MIPS was just acquired by ARM, but acquired by or AMD, and the company that AMD created to make the chips actually acquired MIPS, and they're going to be making RISC-V architecture. But the trend that I've seen that replaced MIPS is ARM. Most of the IoT routers, after a certain point in time, all have ARM architecture, which gives the attackers now a common base. I think there's a lot better Linux support for ARM than there is for MIPS. Likely due like Raspberry Pi and stuff like that. A lot of packages get ported to ARM. So
it's not just the IT either. Like, BMCs are ARM nowadays. Like, a lot of more modern BMCs are ARM and not MIPS.
Oh, so were they MIPS before too, the BMCs?
Yep. I think sometimes we meant MIPS, but like the modern devices, I mostly see ARM.
Yeah. Oh, and then the host reminded me, because I had one of these workstations. Someone was throwing it out back in the day. It was an SGI IRIX workstation. You remember the purple pizza box that was SGI and it ran IRIX? That was a MIPS architecture. Little historical note for you.
You know, it's funny that you mentioned WRT54Gs. I literally have a box of old wireless access points that are all WRT54G sitting in my computer room over there. And every now and then I look at it, and out of nostalgia, I can't get rid of it because it's got, Linksys, Netgear, Cisco, all different manufacturers in it. It just always makes me laugh every time I see it.
Yeah, for sure. Anything else on Netgear?
Not that I can think of specifically.
Let's move to Gigabyte. Actually, kind of impressed how much this was covered in the security news. I'm not sure if anyone else noticed that, but you like literally can't check your security feeds today, security websites, without coming across a reference to a handful of vulnerabilities that were discovered and reported by Binarly, which was weird. It looked like they reported them to Carnegie Mellon CERT rather than AMI directly, unless they had communications with AMI. Because I know the AMI team pretty well. They're awesome people to work with. basically AMI had fixed these issues, right? So AMI being in the supply chain, the kind of the upstream provider to Gigabyte, Gigabyte modifies the UEFI software that came from AMI and customizes it for their specific platforms. But Gigabyte had not applied the updates that AMI had made available to mitigate these issues. And I think that's every single one of them. And there's quite a few motherboards, over 500, that ended up with these vulnerabilities. And they're very similar vulnerabilities to the ones that we've disclosed. They deal with SMM, SMRAM, the ability to put malware, inside of UEFI due to vulnerabilities in the code base. So
Yeah, so I think the delineator there for between where they went and spoke to AMI and where they disclosed through Carnegie Mellon CERT was when the systems were out of date or out of support, out of manufacturing.
Gotcha.
For the ones where Gigabyte was not going to release any patches for, I think those were the ones there where they released through CERT. The other ones where there were patches, they did do a proper disclosure with AMI.
Yeah, so there's a bunch of boards that won't get updates. And what's interesting is this is more common than you think. I think there's a lot of gear out there that has vulnerabilities, ones we've disclosed, ones binarily have disclosed in the past that are just lingering. And like no one's just scanned that particular UEFI version to determine if they have vulnerabilities in it yet. But my laptop from 2020, my MSI, not to pick on MSI, because every manufacturer makes gear and eventually doesn't provide updates for it. Like that's just the way the world works across every single manufacturer. But my MSI laptop, which I love, by the way, it was an i7 I bought in 2020. There was no UEFI update for that subsequent to 2020. So think about all the UEFI vulnerabilities that have been disclosed in the past 5 years, quite a large number of them, that still could persist in that UEFI image that no one's really scanned, right?
Did you just tell us that your system's vulnerable to UEFI malware?
Yeah, it is 100%. It is, and
So,
the question that's a great point though, Wes. Like, what do you do? So what I've recommended in the past and still recommend to this day is take a snapshot of that UEFI system by taking a snapshot of the spy flash, and then monitor that if it changes in any way. Now, there's changes that should happen as a natural course of just operating the system. And then there's other stuff that shouldn't change unless you've applied an update. If there's no updates available, then I actually, again, I'm not trying to pitch the product, but our product does this, right? The product will tell you, hey, your UEFI has changed. So when I'm monitoring that system with Eclipsium, I have that configured as an alert. Tell me if the UEFI changes. I'm assuming you could do that without our product, but it's really hard. Vlad, you might
yeah,
shed light in this because there's like stuff that should change in UEFI and stuff that shouldn't. And,
Yeah.
and figuring that out is
Yeah.
very
Yeah,
difficult.
UEFI has a bunch of variables which are like changing. Like there is literally a boot counter variable sometimes. So every
Right.
time you shut the system down and boot it back up, it changes. So that's normal. What's not supposed to change for sure are UEFI binaries.
Right.
Because if that changes, that's definitely not normal. Like unless you do an update, of course. Like
Right.
if you do an update, that sure you just literally ask the system to update binaries in there. Otherwise, it really doesn't have a reason to. Like, yeah, maybe some vendor somewhere actually does it, in which case I would actually question whether that's a good software design. But
Right.
sure, I don't think we have ever seen that. So because there is literally no reason to do this, right?
Well,
yeah. I
And
mean,
go ahead, Wes.
can't you just monitor PCR0 if your system has a TPM for that change?
maybe, but the problem with PCRs is that they're kind of cryptic. Like, what do they change because of? Like, it might be something other than just UEFI binaries. So that's the problem. Like, sure, it's useful, but you cannot be 100% certain it's not about something else changing as well.
Right.
And in this case, actually dumping the SPI things and checking the changes, it's actually useful. And besides that, some vendors might be backdoored. Like we have seen software getting delivered with backdoors before. Why not UEFI with a backdoor? So somebody tried to even backdoor like label VMA at some point. So I can see somebody trying to backdoor UEFI as well. So you need to monitor not just for changes, but also for potential generic malicious stuff in there, and for that you need binaries themselves. But that aside, dumping it is a problem. Like, yeah, chipsec exists, but for it you need to build a driver and whatnot. So, like, yeah, without a ready-made product, it's pretty problematic. Again, I'm not trying to shield us here, but it's something that I observe.
That's what we, but that's what we do. It's one of the things we do, obviously, really well, is tackle this problem. And it's interesting too that the Gigabyte models, and I didn't look into every single one of them, but it seems like Gigabyte has the issues affect Gigabyte models that are largely for consumer usage. Did you guys get that sense too? I didn't see anything that would indicate it's in a corporate, laptop or desktop, right? I mean, it could be, but
Yeah, I think you find Gigabyte more in the consumer space anyway. Same thing with like MSI, like you mentioned. It's just their target customer base, so to speak. So you're going to see that more in the consumer. That's why you see a lot more of the consumer features that make life a little easier for the home user. Just like the update utility that they were including in UEFI a few years ago that we found some flaws in.
right.
That was really geared towards the home user, and it was embedding things into the operating system.
Yeah, like a lot of motherboards intended for home try to drop a bunch of binaries into the system automatically. Like I have seen this behavior with Asus, I have seen this behavior with Gigabyte specifically. It's not just them though. It's just something I observed in the wild, right? So
there's a facility that in a standard they built to do that in Windows to allow UEFI to drop binaries in the operating system. What is that called now?
I don't know. WPBT, I think, no?
Yes. What is that? WPB Windows Platform Binary Table? WPBT, right?
Maybe.
I think that's what it is.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, I don't know how it's deciphered, but yeah, it's probably what it is. And I don't even know if it checks signatures on that. So that, like, yeah, there's a good question how Windows handles that.
Yeah, it's not something that most people are familiar with or dig into, right? But given what we do, I've dug into it. Now it's starting to come back to me. The story I read was the Microsoft didn't want every OEM coming up with their own way to deliver software to Windows that allows you to update UEFI. So they created the Windows Platform Binary Table as a facility to allow them to do that. So they would all use that more standard way. But then, of course, mistakes can be made. Even though there's a standard way to do it, we still uncovered flaws in that process. So.
I mean, it was less the flaws in the process. The process worked as designed. The flaws were simply put that
software, right?
In the software. Yeah, I mean, it didn't validate. In this case, it didn't validate the SSL certificate or any of the secure communications to the update server. So you ended up in a scenario that if you do a simple man in the middle or DNS poisoning, you could then tell the system that it had a BIOS update or a firmware update, and then that system could automatically upgrade it. And at that point, you can go and give it a malicious UEFI. And, I mean, let's think about this as home users. A lot of them probably are not even running things like Secure Boot unless it was built, natively on that system and was relatively newer or, nowadays running Windows 11, for example. Right. And so suddenly now you can go in and send in some kind of a malicious UEFI module with that update, or a malicious Dixie driver, or leverage the exact same technique to embed a binary into Windows, and suddenly now you have a rootkit in the OS.
So it's interesting too, when look at just like Dell, Lenovo, HP, do they contract with Gigabyte to make a motherboard for their platforms, or are they're designing their own motherboards because they're in control of the UEFI and the platform for the systems that they manufacture, right?
Correct. Yeah, so like the HP and the Dells and the Lenovo's of the world mostly manufacture their own hardware and manage their own complete bottom to top infrastructure. So that's really why you see kind of the people that the organizations, the OEMs, ODMs that use a lot of the very same reference kind of architectures, and then you see the Dell, HP, and kind of Lenovo and to some extent even Supermicro kind of going off and doing their own
Their
things.
own thing, right? But Gigabyte makes a motherboard for you to go build your own computer for the consumer market. Largely is where I've seen them play.
Yep. Yeah, and one of the key things that you'll see there is also, though, as those vendors have stepped up to do a lot more of their own thing, they built their own things like supply chain security programs too.
Yes.
So I mean, HP and Dell, for example, do great jobs of being transparent in their supply chain, are pushing the industry forward with things like actually being able to validate provenance of the firmware and the where the chips were manufactured. And I mean, that's not an insignificant thing for these OEMs to do because it requires things in the factories that have to change. And the concept of, some factory having to add an HSM so that they can properly sign the gear that's leaving that equipment cryptographically, I mean, that's incredible to think of because, it takes time to build these manufacturing workflows at these scales.
Yeah, and it's interesting too. I think the Dell, Lenovo, HPs of the world, right? They take the upstream fixes from AMI. They take that more seriously because they have enterprise customers that are demanding, hey, I need my firmware updates. I want to buy this from you. I want at least 5 years out of it, so you have to give me updates for 5 years. And I think that's why you see Gigabyte, Asus, and more of the gaming manufacturers oftentimes lagging behind on those updates.
Yeah, well, I mean, part of that is just, back revving that or bringing that into their existing code bases. I mean, sure, AMI might do the release, but if they've done any modifications to it that are proprietary for their stuff, they've got to build, test, and deploy that as well. There's also just a simple scenario that they may not have as many people to work on this stuff, and so they might not be able to do the velocity that an enterprise or government driven organization like HP Dell can do.
But I also feel like Asus, Gigabyte, and other similar companies have a lot of products. They have a lot of SKUs, right? And I think they're just iterating faster because they're appealing to the consumer in the gaming market. Every time there's a new chip, and especially if there's a socket change, they're fabbing all new product lines, and that's where their development focus is going. Is we got to support the latest Intel and AMD chips. People want to use it for gaming, and the other stuff they may have made 500 different models and the other stuff, but that's not getting attention because they have to iterate so fast.
Yep. Yeah, and you hit the nail on the head. When you're focused on a consumer market, you have to innovate and move quickly. When you're focused on enterprise and government, you have to support things long term, which means that you're going to have less product lines. You're going to have more, in some regards, stable product lines from a changes perspective. And when you have pieces of equipment, like let's just say like a rack mount server, which can go into an industrial control system that now has to be supported for 20, 25, 30, 40 years, you suddenly are in a completely different game for how you build and design stuff.
Go ahead,
okay. I'm kind of taking us in a different direction, but this pipeline that you're talking about, the influence that gamer culture has on worldwide computing paradigms is so funny because it's like GPUs initially, invented for gaming, right? And then it's like, oh, it turned out that they had a bunch of characteristics that made them really great for crypto mining. Yeah. And then now it's like
password cracking too.
Yeah. Right? And then a bunch of the AI data centers, the neo cloud data centers, were founded by crypto miner guys, former people who'd been doing crypto mining. And then they're like, what are those people good at? They're good at buying GPUs. Turns out that's what you need for crypto mining, and it's what you need for AI data centers. And so you have this pipeline of like, what do people want for their gaming rig to this worldwide like AI data center mega trend. It's wild to watch, and just that sort of like variety in the different components, the different firmwares and stuff that we're talking about, the sort of heterogeneity of that. It's like impossible to keep track of. Any given like enterprise, any given data center, any given environment is going to have all these different you could have tons of different gigabyte UEFI or gigabyte firmwares in one single environment. And how would you know? How would you even figure out? It seems like it would be an incredibly laborious manual process to audit an enterprise environment for these vulnerabilities that we're talking about.
It gets even crazier because if you think about it, what's computer graphics? Like it's matrix multiplication all around. What's AI? It's also matrix multiplication all around. So like they literally do the same operation over and over again. So yeah.
Yeah, but going back to gaming too, it's interesting that the anti-cheat components of gaming requires UEFI plus secure boot. And
I mean,
right, so
they don't work, but okay.
yeah, so but it's also interesting that these vulnerabilities that were disclosed, as are many vulnerabilities in UEFI, allow an attacker to bypass secure boot, right? And I think largely that depends on where the vulnerability lives in UEFI and how early in the process you can execute code allows you to circumvent secure boot.
I mean, just think about it. Secure boot bypass can facilitate cheating in online games or in like pro tournaments and whatnot, because if you bypass secure boot, you can install your cheats. And similarly, if you look at markets, like there is actual special hardware sold for cheating, like a special PCI card which you insert, which pretty much gives you cheats in the game. So
really? I didn't know that.
Yeah, that exists.
So what does it do? Load a Dixie driver from the card?
So specifically, it likes to abuse like the direct memory access technology to actually read game's memory, and then, for example, output you a stream of, let's say, wall hacks on another computer. Or let's say you can connect a mouse through it, and it will automatically click shooting when you hover over an enemy's head, so that like it auto shoots for you, for example. So there are a variety of stuff it does.
DMA
gives them a lot of access, and it's nearly impossible to detect for any anti-cheat because like it doesn't break secure boot, it doesn't break UEFI, it doesn't install any drivers into the kernel memory. You literally have to scan your PCI devices now as an anti-cheat software. So if anything, like we might be able to partner with some anti-cheat software vendor at some point.
Right.
So however crazy it sounds, like it's definitely on the table.
So what do you do if you've got a gigabyte motherboard, right? Obviously, if there's an update that's supported, you have to go manually find that. If you're running Linux, you can use FWUpd. Should tell you if the vendor's participating in the FWUpd or LVFS project. Should tell you if you have an update. But if updates aren't being applied, I mean, do you get a new motherboard, or do you do my hack where you monitor the UEFI? What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean that's the only two solutions. Industry compliance frameworks say if your device is no longer out of support, you have to upgrade it. Now, obviously, enterprises cannot always do that. You have projects, you have budgets, you have life cycles, and when you can't, then you need to put in compensating or remediating controls. And those controls need to be like what you mentioned, where you're monitoring for change, you're monitoring for indicators of compromise, and you're monitoring for indicators of attack. Doing that, like you mentioned, in things like firmware, you need to use tools, whether it be open source or, like Eclipsium, to dump and monitor this stuff, in a scenario where that data can be trusted. Again, things like monitoring TPM is one. So TPM PCRs, if you have that ability, dumping spy, like Vlad was mentioning, with something like ChipSec, or doing things like leveraging our tool to continuously monitor it on a regular basis. Now, I mean, on the threat side of things, the NSA released a great guide for detecting things like Black Lotus, and if you can use that, you can detect it at scale, but it's incredibly difficult to monitor it at scale. So, something to think about.
The final thing that I wanted to close out the show with was talking about NVIDIA GPUs and the Rowhammer attacks. This was also very, very prominent in the security news. Rowhammers, essentially, because the chips are so dense on a DRAM stick of memory that you could read or write adjacent chips on the RAM. I forget exactly how Rowhammer works, but that's the basic premise of it. And these attacks are conducted remotely. I think I was getting it confused earlier this week with the ones where you have to freeze the RAM and then stick it in another system. That's a different attack.
Yeah.
Rowhammer, you do not need physical access. But this is Rowhammer on a GPU, not the system DRAM.
Yeah, and something that was pointed out in the stories about this, which, like you said, it's been written up in Bleeping Computer and Ars Technica, anywhere you'd expect. Something that was pointed out is that this type of sort of memory integrity challenge has been around for CPUs for a long time, and they have mitigations. Essentially, there's like instruction level access controls and stuff to try and mitigate against someone exploit. It's a physical behavior of the DRAM that allows you to cause a bit flip, which I think one of the stories about it quoted that it could potentially reduce model accuracy from 80% down to like 1%. So huge impact to model accuracy of AI stuff being operated on the GPU. But also it's like GPUs, TPUs, the sort of AI specific hardware just are not as far along the trajectory of having had enough just attacks thrown at them over time that they had to build in these kinds of mitigations. So they don't have as mature of security baked into the hardware as CPUs do. And this is something OpenAI had this blog post more than a year ago now about AI infrastructure security. And they talked about how trusted computing environments, confidential computing had been around for a long time in the context of CPU and more legacy systems, but GPUs just are not as far along yet. And they didn't really give the specific concrete examples as much. And now confidential computing is heavily advertised by all of the AI hardware makers. But this was the first concrete example I had seen where it's like, here's a specific thing where GPUs are not as security mature as CPUs that could now be directly exploited to affect AI outcomes.
It sounds like, based on NVIDIA's guidance that they've published on this, that the DRAM in the GPUs supports ECC or error correction, and that enabling this is a mitigation for the attack. I'm not sure if do you take a performance hit with ECC? I mean, on these cards, you probably wouldn't really notice that. I mean, if you're running a large AI model, maybe, but there is a performance hit.
Yes.
ECC, right?
Yes and no. Like if you enable a CC RAM in a game, for example, which was done by, I believe, Linux Stage Tips, you will not see any impact whatsoever on performance. But there is a huge but. AI is actually dependent on DRAM a lot more than it is dependent on actual GPU chip performance. Like, believe it or not, but as far as I have seen, it really depends on DRAM by a large margin. So enabling ECC RAM might affect performance there, but it depends a lot on how good your throughput of that memory will be. Like, if it is still as high, you probably not feel it. And like, again, memory responsiveness might also be important there. Like, how quickly do you get the first byte of data out of it, or first bit? I'm not sure what it reads with. Like, especially considering how many parallel accesses it needs to have for like however many cores modern GPUs have. So there is a good question of how bad of an impact it will have.
The stories reporting on this are speculating like up to 10% performance impact from enabling ECC, which seems bad to me. I mean, context is everything, but I don't want a 10% performance impact on anything I'm doing, right?
Well, I think on most workstations, you're probably not going to notice, but on a large AI workload, 10% you probably will notice, right?
Yeah, if AI workload already takes a day, it will suddenly take 2-3 extra hours, and that might be a lot.
I'm going to notice the fewer Chrome tabs I can run.
Probably wouldn't notice it.
Yeah, like, and again, in consumer hardware, you're not as worried about the 10% because 99% of the time you're not even using it to full potential. Like, if you have something like a 4090 and you run a game, you might be utilizing like 1/3 of your GPU. So even if you enable it there, good luck feeling any difference. Maybe except for like absolute top tier games at absolute ultra settings on 4K screen and whatnot. Maybe you will feel it there, but aside of that use case, nah.
But these
But
were,
for
I
AI,
think,
sure.
yeah, and NVIDIA, I think, listed like Blackwell GPUs as also being, so it's all their AI specific hardware that's also vulnerable to this as well. So whether you're gaming or whether you're doing AI, training models, you're going to want to pay attention to this and, do some testing, but certainly consider enabling ECC to prevent against this attack. So,
I mean, AI specific chips in this case are just bin chips from the same like production line, I guess. Like,
yeah,
oh hey, this is chip for AI is just a better version, like with less broken stuff than it is a 5090 or
right.
whatever, right? So it's not a separate pipeline of the push out chip specifically for AI, and suddenly it's not vulnerable. No, it's the same chip. Like it just bins them based on how many alive transistors are there and how well it handles the load.
Right. Awesome.
So yeah.
So yeah, make sure you check if ECC is enabled on your GPUs. NVIDIA has instructions on how to do that, how to check, and also how to enable it on your system. So I think we're working on a check. It's not an indication that you're necessarily vulnerable, but if you have one of these products and you don't have ECC enabled, it's a finding. Certainly, it's not like definitive proof that you're either vulnerable or succumbing to a threat, but it is an indication of a security control that you should probably consider.
Yep.
So,
Amen.
awesome.
To be
Anything
honest,
else that you guys wanted to add this week? Any of the 3 topics that we talked about?
not really. Like I think that's pretty much it.
Well, fantastic. Thank you, everyone, for listening and watching this edition of Below the Surface. That concludes this episode, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, guys.